ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Welcome back, and hello, this is another tutorial video. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these FileMaker tutorials from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. This is where we're learning more about FileMaker Pro, and in this particular video, we're taking a look at graph management techniques. We're going to be taking control of how you manage your relationship graph. Now, where this video came from is recently I was teaching a 2-week course giving people pretty much a brain dump of everything that I know about developing in FileMaker Pro, and it surprised me how many people didn't know all of the different things that you could do with regards to managing your solution, at least in relation to the graph. So this is going to be a hands-on video. You can pause it, follow along, do whatever you want, or just absorb the material. Let's take a look at the file. All right, to start off with, there is no file, and that's because we're going to be starting with one of FileMaker's starter solutions. Now, I'm working in FileMaker 15 as of the shooting of this video. To follow along, you can simply go up to the New Solution option right there, and after you choose that in FileMaker 15, actually not the New Solution, what I wanted was Get Started. FileMaker renamed these, and they're a little bit different than they are in previous versions, previous to 13. Basically, what we're going to end up doing is I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and then they've got this option right here to see advanced solutions. So in FileMaker 15, they sort of hid this option that they put in sometime around 13 or 14, which is basically select from all of the pre-configured solutions that we have. Now, the one that I'm going to use is event management. Simply double-clicking that is going to allow me to choose to save it right there on my desktop, and that will open right up. So we'll close this file, this getting started file, and we're taking a look at this event management. Now, this is just your standard FileMaker file. It's one that they provide that because you have a copy as well, or access to create a copy, we can go through this together and actually take a look at how we're going to manage our graph. Now, the first thing when we go into our manage database with our Command-Shift-D and we switch on our relationships, that's where we're going to be spending most of our time in this video. Now, this is a very standard simple FileMaker solution. It is not something that's extremely robust where you're scrolling this list for a long time, but your solution, if it's anything that deals with a lot of different areas, it's going to get more and more complex. In fact, one of the biggest problems in FileMaker is basically duplicate table occurrences. You'll create table occurrences because you're working on a script or part of your solution, and you end up with these duplicates and you don't even necessarily know that you have those duplicates. Now, what we have in here is we simply have a very basic graph. This is never how I would actually approach a FileMaker solution unless I knew for absolute sure it was always going to stay this simple. Primarily because everything in the FileMaker relationship graph is hidden. It's hidden to us, and I've complained about this for a long time. There's so many things that FileMaker could do from a UI visual standpoint to indicate what's going on. But when we look at this table occurrence group, as it's called, we have no idea in terms of these relationships what their settings are. None. We can't tell right off the bat. So we're forced to go in and double click each one of these. Okay, on this particular relationship, I can see that I have allow creation turned on and delete turned on as well. I don't have sort turned on, but if I go over here to, let's say, this relationship, I believe this one has sort on this side of the relationship and this. So this is, to me, is a problem. It really lacks clarity and knowledge about your solution. On top of that, there's no common area that you can go as a developer in order to access things. So we're going to break this down into all of the different things that I do in order to actually make my graph much more manageable in a FileMaker solution. So before we do that, I'm going to head over to the Manage area again, and we're going to look at our layouts. That's just because I want to see how many layouts are in this solution. Now, FileMaker does this a lot in their starter solutions. They create a desktop, tablet, and phone version. I am not a fan of that. Actually, I prefer to create a hybrid tablet desktop version, and then if I need to, create the smaller form factor of a phone version. So this particular solution has a lot more layouts than I would prefer to have, but I am going to create a new folder. And that new folder is primarily going to be called Developer. Now, you always want to be able to see your data the way that you want to see it, which is basically if fields aren't on the user interface that you're designing, but you still want to be able to access those, you still need to be able to see those layouts. So my approach to the graph is typically to do this. My solution will end up being over here in terms of the graph, and I will use the area over here for the purpose of my legend and for developer tables. So developer tables are simply just base tables. So in this case, we've got events. Now, here's a key thing to recognize. You notice that when I selected off of the table that was previously selected, it changed the name down here each time that I click here. So what I'm going to do is I always like to use, I documented this in 2010, I prefix any of my developer tables with the @ symbol. Primarily because it makes it very easy to sort things, or things become sorted when you're looking at all of the possible options. When I double click and then I select on one of the pop-ups in the rest of FileMaker, you'll see that that will allow me to do that. So what I do is I have a developer table for each one of these particular instances. So I'm not going to show you going through and doing all of this. I'm going to pause the video and then we'll come back and see exactly what I've done. So there we are. We've got some changes that I've put in place, and I want to talk about some of those changes that I just took a little while to make. Now, first off, when you come into the graph now, what you're going to see is you're going to see a list of my base tables. That's basically going to be all of my developer tables. These are going to be tied to layouts, as you're going to see, that I create for myself, that from a security standpoint, I'm really only going to allow myself to go in and see those layouts as a developer. But it's a place where I can put all of my fields and see everything that's going on behind the scenes. Now, right next to that, you can see that I have a legend. Now, my legend is going to, in my particular use colors in order to clearly identify distinct areas of use within FileMaker itself. Now, many developers that I know, or not, I shouldn't say many, some developers I know like to use color in the form of coloring similar base table names. For example, if I select on events right here and I want to know all of the other table occurrences that use events, FileMaker does provide this nice little feature down here at the bottom that I can always use to select related tables one away or to select tables with the same source. So you can see right there, by being able to simply use that Command U, I'm able to see all of the different tables that are that same base table. So in this case, I've got three different tables that are now highlighted. And of course, it pays to maybe select a very visible highlight color, which is part of the OS. That's all controlled within your preferences here in the system preferences and the highlight color that you choose. But here I have the three tables that are all selected for me, so I can always see what are the same base tables. So for me, selecting all of these and then saying, I want all of this particular table to be this color. And then for this particular table, I want it to be this color. And then for this particular table, I want it to be this color. Well, I end up with a little bit of a fruit salad effect. And I really don't care about what the base tables are for each of the table occurrences. I simply want to know how are those table occurrences being used in the whole of my solution. That's just my particular approach. So what I do is I simply reset all of these to some gray. It really doesn't matter what you set them to. There's a lighter gray. But I start to identify all of the table occurrences based on their explicit use within FileMaker. Now, it doesn't mean that they are only used for that one aspect, but it does mean that they are going to be used for that as the primary aspect. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to, let's say, for example, we'll take a look at our desktop over here in our Manage Layouts. I can see that most everything here is tied to this table occurrence called events. Now, the first thing that I like to do in my graph is I like to identify, at least from the standpoint of the table occurrence name, I like to identify that that particular table occurrence is what it provides within my solution. And this will make a little bit of sense as we go along. But first and foremost, I need to color this according to its use in FileMaker. And according to my legend, layouts are a dark purple. So with this object or this table occurrence selected, down in the colors, what you're going to recognize is there's something that I do. I basically choose one row and then use that row pretty consistently. So I use this blue for my portals, I'll use this purple for my layouts, and then I'll use this orange, giving me enough of a spread in between the distance of those colors. So having made that selection, I now know that this particular table occurrence is going to be used as a layout. And I happen to go one step further in terms of my naming convention in order to identify which table occurrence are used as layout table occurrences. Now, this type of decision really boils down to whether or not you're going to use a particular graph model over another. I'm sure you've probably heard the term anchor buoy. Maybe you've now heard selector connector. Somebody's throwing around the term of a unified graph model. Basically, a table occurrence simply represents a perspective of data. It can be used for a portal, a layout, for a value list, for simply using a lookup for a field, you name it. But most table occurrences have a primary purpose. It is either to feed data, to display data, or to, again, provide data for a value list. You can see that I have values identified in yellow right here, or orange. Orange also, in my particular model, represents utility layouts. So with this layout right here, with this table occurrence, what I would end up doing is actually using my convention that I started back in 2010. I would simply identify this as a layout. And that layout will simply have the prefix of layout. And then I use this little chevron character, which for me is Option, Shift, and then pipe character, which is above the return key. But what I love to do is I love to keep the base table name at the end of the table occurrence name. And I'm going to tell you why. What happens is in the rest of FileMaker Pro, you have these pop-ups. You have pop-ups when you're selecting from table occurrences for buttons, for portals, for all kinds of different things. And FileMaker uses this pop-up menu in a sorted order. So what that does is it provides you with the opportunity to know that whatever prefix you use, if you keep a consistent prefix throughout a table occurrence chain, then you're able to keep all of those table occurrences sorted together as long as you use the same prefix. But you still are able to recognize what the base table is because that's always the ending value. So if we look here at this FileMaker solution, it basically says venue looked up, which in order for me to decipher this, I have to have been the developer that actually created this. I'm not able to just come into this graph and see instantly what is this table occurrence tied to. Well, that requires me to actually double click and look at this. Oh, it's tied to events. So for me, what this actually ends up being called is venue looked up. I haven't looked at it itself quite yet, but I'm simply going to rename it to events. And if it's a lookup, then I would rename it and it would become something like this: venue lookup events. So now right off the bat, I know that this table occurrence is tied to events and this table occurrence is tied to events. And it's simply probably some type of self-relationship. So that's the first thing that I do. And you're going to see as I look at the solution and spend a little bit more time cleaning it up, what will happen is, let's go over to an actual events layout. We'll open that up, my layout events. And you can see right here, I get a really nice degree of consistency in this. And that is my table occurrence, or my layout name is named layout events. Well, I might name it just events. FileMaker actually renamed the layout for me because of that table occurrence name. I would simply have to go in and rename this particular layout if I wanted it to be something else. But thanks to FileMaker, it did that. Let's go ahead and rename it back to events. Once I've renamed it explicitly, FileMaker will retain that rename and it'll simply just use that layout. But you can see right here, I get a little bit more indication here in my solution of where these are actually pointing to. It is a layout. It's a table occurrence base that identifies it as a layout, and it's based on the base table of events. But if we open this particular layout, and I think I want the details layout because that's the one that's going to have portals. So let's open that. And I'm going to go into layout mode on this, and I have a portal. I can see right here, the portal is simply named contributors. Very generic, non-explicit, doesn't really tell me a whole lot, but I can see that contributors right there should actually get the treatment of my coloring that is portals. So I'm going to select that and choose on my coloring right there. So now I know that that is a particular portal when I look at this solution. And like I said, in some cases, what I will do is I will explicitly identify this sometimes as a portal, but that's not predominantly what I do. What I do is I tend to name, because you end up with all kinds of different connections of table occurrence groups. I end up naming my portal, or my table occurrences in the form of functional use, then base table. So it basically looks like this. Functional use or implementation, and then base table. And that's pretty much what it is. So in this case, this would become contributors, like it was. But I need to find out what this is in relation to this particular solution. So I'm going to call this quite quickly donations. Can't speak and talk at the same time, or can't type and talk. So I'm doing this just for the purpose of this video. I don't know that this has to do with donations at all, but it is going to give you a clue as to why and how I name things the way that I do. So down the chain, this table occurrence chain, we have some contacts. And really, I don't know what this context deals with. I just know that it's hanging off of this particular item of contributors. So it really, again, requires me to have been the developer to actually understand what's going on. But if I was developing this solution in the context of I've got events and I've got donations coming from contributors, those contributors, I need additional detail coming from contacts, why not follow the theme of donations with the base table name? So what you're going to see in this scenario, as I zoom in here, is you can see that I'm establishing a chain where I know that all of those items are going to be sorted within the context of how they're actually used. So starting from my origin, my layout of events, I have in the chain of table occurrences that are going to deal with donations, I have contributors, and then it still deals with the aspect of donations, contacts, and then down here, I would further have this renamed, and I can see that this is a assigned task list. So let's go ahead and actually address this. So they do have the base table name off the end, which is really nice. So in this case, if I was following form, I would have donations assigned list maybe. And then tasks is already implied right there because I know it's the base table. So tasks list maybe isn't something that I needed to put. So hopefully you can see that through this chain of renaming, what I've done is when you're on the layout and you're double-clicking and you're in FileMaker, when you make those selections from those pop-ups, look at what's sorted and grouped together for you. Donations contacts, donations contributors, donations assigned list, tasks. Everything becomes grouped all because of the fact that FileMaker likes to sort all of its different options or its table occurrences that are possible, both related and unrelated, in alpha order. So that's why I like to name my table occurrences with that prefix so that it makes sense and it's easier for myself or others to actually follow in the solution. All right, so I've headed back into the relationship graph, and hopefully at this point you can see how clear it is to understand what's going on when I come into this graph. It's not just a connection of table occurrences where I have to decipher them and they're all the same color. There's a degree of management, organization, and basic understanding because I've given myself a legend. Now, if you're using anchor buoy, then you're going to know that you'll basically have an anchor all the way on the left-hand side, and then all of your buoys will go all the way out to your right-hand side. Graph models to me are simply just different ways of people using the graph in order to organize things. And by putting all of the anchors on the left-hand side, that is just simply an organizational technique. I do not personally limit myself to creating a brand new anchor for new buoys if those buoys duplicate some of the features within my relationship graph. So very often I will actually make a selection, and I have no problem making this particular table occurrence actually being a layout in the middle of my table occurrence group. And I've heard some people, I think at the last DevCon, I think Chad, I don't want to mess up who it was, but somebody was promoting this notion of a unified graph model. And that's basically they're saying, well, they don't just use anchors with buoys hanging off the end. They will also take advantage of having using table occurrences for layouts within their graph. But then you get into the whole notion of, is this going to grow too big and be a massive spider graph? Well, I can address that by basically saying that a lot of developers don't necessarily take the time to look at the graph as a perspective of solutions within your solution. There's absolutely nothing that prevents you from creating a completely different view off of a table occurrence that now becomes disconnected. So as I select and make this one that same color that I think that, no, let's see, it's one more gray up. I forget, but we'll get close enough. So what happens is FileMaker, when it initially opens, has to evaluate everything that is on the graph. That's where the separation model really starts to pay off, when you have separate UI files. If you have this massive solution, because you're able to segment things out, learning about using one-to-one relationships and taking your tables from a very wide set of tables to very narrow tables, all of those different tactics, they really make your solution, your FileMaker solution, perform that much better. But from a graph management standpoint, you still have issues that this whole graph needs to be read. And if you constantly tack on table occurrence after table occurrence after table occurrence, building new feature and new feature and new feature into one table occurrence group, of course, your solution's going to get slower and slower and slower and slower, because FileMaker has to evaluate every one of these relationships every time that the user is on any given context where all of that data needs to be evaluated. On top of that, any related tables that it's hitting, however wide those tables are, those tables have to load all of that data, not just the data that's actually being shown within the portal. It's just how FileMaker works. So from a performance standpoint, I will many times create completely separate table occurrence groups in order to have similar functionality. Now, do you end up with more scripts? Yes, you do, but your graph becomes more transparent in terms of the solution overall. From this standpoint, coming into this solution, had this been the graph that I initially opened, I would have been able to easily see, oh, why is this purple? Oh, because it's a layout. Oh, on this layout in the detail perspective, what are portals? Oh, okay, all of these are portals. I can see that data is being clearly shown in each of those table occurrences, and it's pulling data from all of the rest of these table occurrences in this table occurrence group. So the next thing that I'm going to show you that I do in my graph is I segment out functionality. And that functionality comes from the standpoint of value lists and also from the standpoint of your cascading deletes. So now let's take a look at that. All right, so now we're taking a look at the next stage or the next evolution of this graph. Now granted, the graph has grown. We've added more table occurrence groups to this graph in order to provide the functionality of segmentation. Now, this segmentation helps me understand the graph right when I come into it by breaking out different parts of the whole of the solution, making it easier for me as the developer to manage. Now, of course, there's a trade-off here. You need to always determine how much more complexity does this add to my graph. In my opinion, it's not so much that it actually is worth doing just for the clarity. Now, in our original table occurrence group, what happens is we end up building this FileMaker solution, and at the beginning it starts out and it's really easy and it's really nice, but then it grows and it grows and it grows, and eventually you have such a massive bowl of spaghetti that pulling things out of that or understanding what's going on really becomes pretty complex. Now, because FileMaker doesn't actually indicate on the relationships itself, which I believe they should, with a little plus and a little minus and maybe a little S for sorts directly on the relationships, on the respective side of the relationship indicator as to which those checkboxes are checked, that for me is a problem. And typically I solve this by actually drawing out a little note. Well, that wasn't a big enough note right there. Is the option key to get? It's not, option key is not going to do it. I'll just drag the note out. And typically what I'll do is I'll make a little green and I'll set the color to white. And I'll give myself a little plus sign. Maybe I'll use something really big like Arial Black. It'll be really big and make it like 14 points. And what I end up was with this little table occurrence indicator right here. And maybe you've seen me do this in previous videos where I will simply put these little indicators, and I'll make a little copy of this one right here. Double click on that, go in and actually make it the minus sign and switch that to red. Now, in a super complex FileMaker solution, this does sometimes pay off, but of course, many times in your FileMaker solution, you're constantly dragging things around. as you make room for new things. So I'm going to drag this, put this over here. Well, I need to remember, and many times my relationship lines become lost when I have this little plus and this little minus that I use right here in order to indicate on this relationship I've got a plus and a minus. It really becomes a little bit convoluted. I still do this in some of my solutions as once the graph sort of becomes more of a fixed feature and I'm not doing as much development on the graph. It's a much more mature FileMaker solution. But one thing that I've been doing actually for a couple years is I've been segmenting out the functionality. Not because that it's something that I like to do, because I'd love to keep it in the graph if I was able to understand, but because it makes it a little bit easier from a management standpoint. And that is, I'm starting to segment all of my cascading deletes out. Now that means that this, as a table occurrence group, is here for presenting and providing the user interaction with my solution. This right here is for me as the developer to know what my cascading deletes are. And in this course that I gave recently, it surprised me that developers didn't know that no matter where the delete option is set, that delete option is going to apply regardless of the layout that you are on. So for example, on this relationship, it was previously set to have both of the options of allow creation of related records, which that I do want to allow through the course of use of my solution. This one you're almost always going to have on any layout that's tied to a table occurrence because the user needs to be able to create related records in a portal. But the delete does not have to be on that relationship for the purpose of displaying within the UI. It can be in a completely separate group of table occurrences. So in this particular situation, what I've done is I've named everything delete events, again, base table at the end, delete contributors, delete tasks, delete events, etc. It's not going to come up as one of the related tables when I'm working within my table occurrence group that represents my solution. But what happens is, because this relationship does have the delete specified on it, FileMaker will abide by that because it's within the graph. This also applies within the separation model. If you're using multiple files with a UI file sitting in front, maybe on a local device or even hosted on a server, and that's pointing to a data file, the data file itself can have a structure such as this, containing only your interconnected table occurrences where the cascading deletes need to apply. And then within your UI file, if we shoved this away off to the side and pretended it didn't even exist, in our data file, cascading deletes are in that table occurrence group that we just shoved off screen, but in our main solution, we never have the delete option selected in anything that the user is dealing with within the user interface. But lo and behold, when the user is on this table occurrence and they delete an event record, because the graph is actually represented either in the data separation model or here in this local file, this same file, those records will be deleted. You delete an event, all contributors, tasks, agenda, and guests will be deleted because of this table occurrence group. So, by segmenting things out, what we gain is we gain the advantage of being able to understand more about our solution visually right when we come into the graph. And I also do this with regards to value lists. It's very easy to sprinkle value lists within this relationship graph, and then trying to pick them out and determine where they're actually coming from and how they're driven, that becomes a little bit of a burden when you get a much larger solution. So here in my legend, I have values, and then off to the side, as I've stated before, I will explicitly name things such as this. Values, events, and I will color that to be orange. And then off of value events, let's say there are certain contributors or something to that effect. Say values and whatever it represents. Values, let's say special contributors. And I basically have these interconnected table occurrences where I come into a solution, and basically what I see is I see a group of table occurrences that are orange that represent my values. all of my related value lists come from that interconnected table occurrence group. All of my cascading deletes, they're all managed by my red table occurrence group, and then the core of my solution is managed right here. Now again, as I stated, you do have the additional overhead of interconnected table occurrence groups. But the great thing is you don't have to go into your main solution and try to decipher where things are. You know where to control them immediately. You need a new value list? Fine. You're going to wire that up off of your interconnected table occurrence group that deals with values. You need a new table, or you added a new table and it has some children that need to delete when a parent record is deleted? Fine. You wire it up to your cascading deletes. You're designing your UI, that's going to be within your main table occurrence group. So the last thing that I'm going to provide you with is a little tip about those developer layouts and how I actually organize and what I do from a theming standpoint. But hopefully throughout the course of this video, you've been able to get a better understanding of how you can manage and organize your graph so that things make sense. What I've done is I've created another copy of the event management that FileMaker originally provides. Going into this graph, as you can see, you get very little guidance or education about what you've created yourself, or from the standpoint of another developer looking at what you've created. I have no clue coming into this graph. I just have it shoved up into a corner and I sort of have to decipher and make sense of things as they stand. Going over to the version that we have now modified, coming into this graph, a little bit more chaotic it looks like, but once we get past the chaos, things become pretty obvious. Our very clearly identified legend tells us what things are. We have a layout, and I know that I've got a layout based on that. I've got portals, and I know what those are based off. I can look at the deletes, and I may not understand why I'm segmenting out my cascading deletes, but maybe as time goes on, I'll understand it's better to manage that outside of my internal solution than it is to manage it within it. Values, everything is pretty much clearly indicated. My base tables is the last thing that I'm going to go over in this particular video. And that is, you want to create a dedicated layout for each of your dedicated base tables and make that layout something that you can use as a developer in order to see things. So as we go and take a look at that and wrap this video up, when I go into the Manage Layouts, as I indicated earlier in the video, we have a developer folder that I create. That developer folder, I then create one initial developer table, prefixed with that @ symbol, @agenda in this case. When I open this particular layout, what you're going to see that I've done is I've taken the opportunity to start to create developer layouts that make it easy for me to see the data. And these layouts, again, you're going to lock them off according to your privilege set so that users can't get to these layouts. They're just for you as the developer. You can use them when you target them with execute SQL or other functions within FileMaker if you want to do that. You can always create scripts that will have full access privileges, be able to go to a developer layout, do something, and then come back to a regular user interface layout. Remember, you always want to turn allow user abort off on those particular scripts at the very beginning of those scripts. But here's what I do to set up my developer layouts. Heading into layout mode, what I've done is the first thing I do is I set all developer layouts to be table view. So by going up to my layout and my layout setup, when I click on the Views tab, which I have right there in the layout setup, you're going to see that I've initially switched the default view to table view. I turn off form view. I turn off list view. There's only a few developer layouts that I leave set to form view, and that's when dealing with global tables. I'll select on properties. I always turn on all part options, top, header, footer, bottom navigation. I like a lighter grid style. So FileMaker originally has some darker gray set. I like to set it to a very subtle gray myself. And I'd keep the horizontal and the vertical grids on. If I'm dealing with images, it's really useful to be able to turn on this custom height and actually give yourself a much larger height on tables that are used to store images if you want to be able to preview those images. So once I have all of those settings the way that I like them on a particular layout, then the first thing that I do is I create a dedicated theme for my developer layouts. In other words, I want to have a developer theme, and then I have my user solution theme, or multiple themes within my user solution. So by right-clicking here, or you can always click up in the top on the theme settings, The very first thing that I did in this solution is I scrolled down to minimalist. I chose minimalist originally. Once I chose minimalist, I then selected my header, and under the Appearance tab in the inspector, I set the header to a color of green. Now, according to the way that I've used my colors in FileMaker Standards, what I created in 2010, I use green as an indicator to know that this particular table or this layout is tied to a table that's internal to this file. Otherwise, if I'm using the data separation model, then I like to know that the table that I'm looking at is actually displaying data from an external file, from another file. So in that case, what I end up doing is changing the header color to red. So it's very much a simple green light, red light type of scenario. Red, the data is coming from an external file to the one I'm actually working in. Green, the data is coming from a file that is a table that is internal to this solution. So once I make that switch, I save the default by choosing Save Current Style, and then I'm afforded the opportunity, which originally it starts off as minimalist, to simply save as a new theme. I give that theme the name Developer, and then I'm able to save the changes to that theme. So from now moving forward, all of my developer layouts are going to be able to have, and I'm going to be able to see all of my developer data. That's simply a matter of selecting all here in my field picker. I turn my labels off. I drag all of my fields onto the layout. I go the extra step and like to just make them all the same size. If you don't know this one particular thing about FileMaker, you can move and arrange fields when viewed in table order in any order that you want them presented. When I go into browse mode, on table view, you have the option to right-click on any given header. When you right-click and go down to table view, FileMaker provides this nice little option to reset. And what reset is going to do is it's going to look at the layout and the order in which the fields actually appear. So if I reset this and say yes, what's going to happen is I'm going to get agenda, agenda item, explanation, etc. If I want my primary key, which in this case is event ID, I simply go into layout mode and I want the event ID to come first. I want the date, then I want the time. Maybe I want my match field actually after that. Then I want my explanation and we'll put my time frame order right there. So it really doesn't matter as long as the fields in the order in which they are presented come in the order that you want to see them. You can go back into browse mode and it looks like FileMaker already did that for me. But if I have already realigned things and it's hosted on FileMaker and it says, do you want to save? Recognize that you can always right click, go to reset. It'll ask you, say yes, and then it'll put all the fields in the order in which they are actually presented in layout mode. So with this primary layout now, and there's many pieces of information that I put here up in the top, typically using merge fields. So if I'm going to put a merge field, I'm actually going to go up to the insert, the other symbol, and let's get the layout table name. Always a nice thing to know. I'll make that, let's see, text. We'll set that to white. Let's increase it, put it up there. Just a nice little idea to know what is the table name that this particular table is based off of. Go into browse mode. I can see that it's at agenda. This helps me out because even if I do not have the area above or the title bar is not showing my base table, this is showing me the base table. I can include additional information, what record number I'm on, what account I'm logged in, anything that you find within that other symbol, you can put here as detailed information for you as the developer. Once I have this one layout done, then all I do is it's preset to how I like it to be. I simply just start to duplicate that and tie it to all of my developer layouts. So contacts becomes at contacts and so on until I have all of my developer layouts. Once I have all of them, I can of course select them contiguously, click open, and it will open all of my developer layouts all at one time. Of course, here on contacts, you can see that I simply need to remove all of the fields, go in, reselect everything using the field picker. FileMaker is going to ask me to make that layout larger. No problem. I'm going to drag this larger. Actually, let's drag the footer out. And I'm going to hold down the Option key in order to move through the table or through the fields, and then I get all of my contacts and so forth. That is what I like to do with regards to making the graph much easier to manage. For me to be able to manage the data using developer layouts and using those legends, labels, segmented groups of table occurrences, and everything that I can do that makes it easier to manage the whole of my solution. So I hope throughout the course of this video, you've been able to get a better sense of what you can do. In this case, a better sense of how you can organize your own FileMaker solution so that it makes sense not only to you, but to anyone else as well, on Teams, you name it. This is how I like to manage my graph, how I like to use colors, and hopefully some of these tips will help you out in your future FileMaker development. Until next time, I'd like to wish you much luck and happy FileMaking. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.